Turn off or silence electronic devices, please. And we would appreciate that you not use them for other routine uses during the presentation. So in about 3 minutes, we'll be started. Good evening. Good evening. My name is Colonel Murph Clark. I'm the Professor of Aerospace Studies and the Commanding Officer of Air Force ROTC, along with Colonel Robert Kukuk, the Professor of Naval Science and Commanding Officer of Naval ROTC, which subsumes both the U.S. Navy and Colonel Kukuk's own beloved U.S. Marine Corps, and Colonel Eric Brigham, the Professor of Military Science and Commanding Officer of the U.S. Army ROTC Battalion. I welcome you to tonight's event. The three ROTC departments together constitute Norwich's College of National Services. The College of National Services has the honor tonight in hosting the first event of the 2015 Todd Lecture Series. Please help me extend a warm welcome to President Emeritus and retired Major General W. Russell Todd, Norwich class of 1950, and his wife, Carol. The Todd Lecture Series is named in honor of Carol Todd. Though they are not here tonight, we hope they may be watching in the streamed version of the lecture. So I would also like to recognize the Todd's daughter and son-in-law, Ellen and John Drew, and the Drew Foundation, who have generously donated resources to Norwich for the specific purpose of funding this entire lecture series. Since its founding in 2008, the mission of the Todd Lecture Series has been to bring revered, provocative, and surprising speakers to Norwich campus and North Field. And tonight we continue that mission. We all know our world is shrinking, and globalization has made our world increasingly interdependent. What affects one nation, no matter how small, affects us all. As citizens of such a powerful nation as the United States, we take seriously our role in addressing problems around the globe, whether caused by natural or human events. In his talk this evening, General Gordon R. Sullivan will address the connection between national security and climate change, the challenges, and some surprising opportunities. Born in Boston and raised in nearby Quincy, General Sullivan earned a Bachelor of Arts in Political Science from Norwich in 1959, and then commissioned as a second lieutenant in the United States Army. After an already long and distinguished career that included commands and staff duty at every level, including service in Washington, D.C., and multiple assignments overseas, General Sullivan's active duty Army service culminated in his promotion to the highest position in the United States Army, where he served for 4 years as the 32nd Chief of Staff of the Army and as a member of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. He retired from the top spot in 1995 after more than 36 years as a soldier in uniform. His military decorations include the Purple Heart, the Bronze Star, and the Defense Distinguished Service Medal. But I have heard that he is most proud to have earned the Combat Infantry Badge for his service in Vietnam. Since 1998, he has served as President and CEO of the Association of the United States Army, in recognition of which he was awarded the prestigious Sylvanus Thayer Award by the West Point Association of Graduates. He has served long and faithfully as Chairman of the Board of Trustees of Norwich University and Chairman Emeritus of the Marshall Legacy Institute. General Sullivan has been Chairman of the Board of Trustees at Norwich since 2003. Can you imagine the depth of understanding and the breadth of experience he brings to executive leadership after starting out at Norwich in 1955 as a scholarship student, earning his way through college by washing dishes in the mess hall? Gordon Sullivan has traveled the world and lived the range of human experience. He has led the most powerful army in the world and worked in the kitchen. He is a priceless treasure not only to Norwich, but to a grateful nation. General Sullivan is certainly revered. I dare to remind him that the mission of the Todd Lecture Series also charges the speaker to be provocative and surprising. I'm sure you won't be disappointed. Please welcome to the podium a soldier, General Gordon R. Sullivan.
Murph, that was terrific. Thank you very much. Wait a minute. What happened? There it is. Oh, my speech. I thought you left with it. This is the place where I took my oath as a cadet in 1955. It's the place where I graduated in 1959. And it's the place where General Todd told me one day, after I had become the Chief of Staff of the Army and had given a speech here, that I was an honorary corporal. I never had any rank here at Norwich either, so I need to tell everybody that. And then my mother was in the audience, and I said, "See, Ma, I did it." Anyway, President and Mrs. Snyder, General and Mrs. Todd, Dr. Catherine White from the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, Vermont Lieutenant Governor Phil Scott, senior members of the Vermont administration and legislature, fellow trustees, Maxine Grad, who is a member of the legislature here in Vermont, and Keith Barrett, who's a trustee. Norwich University Alumni Association Board of Directors, who's meeting here for 2 days. And lastly, members of the faculty, staff, student body, and friends of Norwich from Central Vermont. It's great to be back. I'm very fond of Norwich, as is probably obvious to everybody in the room, for any number of reasons. Since retiring in 1995, I've been involved in lots of things involving the defense of the nation and security issues. And interestingly, one of the topics which has become more important over the last 20 years is climate change. Quite honestly, I didn't pay much attention to it other than an episode I will tell you about in my remarks. I really started paying attention to it when I was asked to become a member of a board of retired flag officers, generals, and admirals on a study group put together by an organization which at one point was called the Center for Naval Analysis, because their analytical work mainly involved maritime subjects, ships, power systems, and so forth. And then they branched out into other areas of national security, and they became the CNA Corporation, still a not-for-profit think tank mainly. This study was climate change and national security. And the bottom line of that study, which was published in 2007, and a follow-on study on the same issue, concluded that our national security and the accelerating risks of climate change were linked. It became obvious to us being the study group, after the first 2 meetings we had, was that we could not be dwelling on data points, individual data points and formula and so forth, because once you started talking numbers, very specific numbers, everybody had a shot at you, and they missed the forest for the trees. So, given that most of us, there were 12 of us, most of us were not qualified as climate scientists. There were 2. One was an astronaut, and the other was a Navy oceanographer, and they were familiar with the details of the whole subject. But the general agreement of the group was that we would look at the trends. And that's what we did. And frankly, all the trend lines were moving in the wrong direction. Sea level was rising, the Earth was becoming warmer, and things were not looking good. Our first report, published in 2007, identified climate change as a threat multiplier, and especially in fragile areas of the globe. And that will come as no surprise to any of you who have looked even remotely or for a distance reading the newspapers. Back in 2007, we looked at climate change very regionally, and we thought of it as we would think about the combatant commanders of the United States. You know, we have a combatant commander in Honolulu from the Pacific. We have one down in Florida, Central Command, which has been in the paper for years now, given the 2 wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. Southcom in Miami, that's the Central and South America. And we focused on external, it was mostly external, threats that would come to the United States because of the damages and the ravages of climate change. We found that many developing countries and others with fragile governments do not have the social infrastructures to cope with the types of stressors that they were, in fact, experiencing. And when a government can no longer deliver services to people and ensure domestic order and protect the nation's borders from invasion, conditions are ripe for turmoil, extremism, and terrorism, which will fill the vacuum. It's like putting a dish out on the back porch for the cat, a dish of milk, and the sun starts to create funny little things that grows in there. And in fact, what was happening is these countries, Somalia in particular, and I'll just speak a minute about Somalia, there's bad things happening in that little dish. Somalia is a case in point. I was the Chief of Staff in the Army, 1991 to 1995, and in 1992, Somalia started to fall apart. It was a failing state anyway, and what we saw was 2 years or more of drought in Somalia, and you began to see a humanitarian crisis of enormous proportion. Probably the picture which galvanized the United States of America to become involved was a picture of I never knew whether it was a vulture or a buzzard, but it was a big bird standing beside a young child with big eyes, looking down at that child, waiting until that child perished. And you knew what happened next. It was at that point when the United States and the UN, many UN nations were galvanized to start providing aid to the Somalian people. The first response was humanitarian aid, and each of the services was involved in some way. What then became apparent was that corruption was rife, the warlords controlled the food, and they were feeding who they wanted to feed, and the others just perished. That's when things started to heat up, and bad things happened 3 and 4 October with what is now known as Black Hawk Down. My point is that that's probably the first time I really saw what global climate change was all about. The two rivers that provided the irrigation for what had been a fairly robust agricultural community and this failed state combined to create that crisis. You can look no further than the rest of the Horn of Africa for the last 2 decades to get more examples. Sustained drought caused food shortages and the overturn of fragile governments, which led to chaos and infiltration by extremists. And just as we predicted in 2007, we are seeing the same thing happen in Mali, Niger, and across much of Central Africa, the Sudan included. In 2007, we predicted that in the near term, much of Asia would suffer the opposite effect, which was too much water. As the planet warms, the majority of the heat is absorbed in the ocean, interestingly enough, since the world has more oceans than land. And this causes 2 problems. The first problem is that the ocean expands, and the result is sea level rise, which is amplified by melting glaciers, which are happening all over the world. We also predicted that rising seas would threaten low-lying coastal areas. Major deltas like the Mekong, the world-famous Mekong, the Rice Bowl for much of Asia, the Ganges, Brahmaputra in Bangladesh, and low-lying islands, which are all over Asia. Today, entire island nations are preparing to move hundreds of thousands of people to avoid the rising sea. Can you imagine what would happen if Bangladesh was forced to move the population of Bangladesh because of floods, persistent floods, in the Delta, in their Delta region? Where would they go? Who would take them? What would that do to India, Burma, Myanmar, or would they even take them? These are huge problems. Now, the conclusion of our study was that climate change was a source of instability. Mass migrations, disease of pandemic dimensions, floods, loss of protein, loss of the sources of protein, not only meats, grains, and fish. Fish. The East African coast has been overfished. Somali refugees are moving south into Kenya, and they seek protein, and some of it comes from fish. In 2014, we updated the 2007 findings, and in this area, we published our most recent report. This report identifies the accelerating risk of climate change and observes that in some circumstances, climate change has and will increasingly serve as a catalyst for conflict. Not good news. In developing the second report, we found that much of what we had predicted in 2007 was starting to happen. But we also discovered the world is much more interconnected today than we actually knew at the time. We knew it was interconnected. That's fairly obvious to all of us. But we tended to look at it in regions, as I said, Pacific Command, Central Command, European Command, and so forth. But let me give you an example. In the summer of 2010, Russia, China, and the United States had devastating droughts, which resulted in a drastically reduced wheat crop. Egypt, as well as most of northern Africa, imports most of its wheat, which provides over half of the caloric intake of much of its population. Russia decided to stop all exports of wheat to feed their own people. Sounds reasonable, but the price of wheat skyrocketed, and Egypt, Tunisia, and others suffered wheat and bread shortages and huge price spikes. This resulted in food riots in the winter and spring of 2011, which precipitated, in some way, Arab Spring. While there are deep underlying structural problems and causes for what happened. But one of the catalysts that set that Arab Spring off can be directly attributable to weather and climate change. From this and other examples, we came to realize that it was not just fragile governments in one region that were at risk, but robust governments were also threatened by the effects of climate change far from their own country. To keep this focused on how the accelerating risk of climate change might impact you and the failure and the future of U.S. national security, let me focus on 4 areas to kind of sharpen the pencil for you. First, how the projected impacts of climate change may cause instability around the world. Second, the impact of the changes we are seeing in the Arctic. Third, how climate change will likely impact our military. And finally, how climate change will impact elements of our national power. So you can see the shift. We are now starting to look at U.S. infrastructure and its role in our own national security and how others see us and how capable we are as a nation to do what we have been doing. And I will give you some, since I'm supposed to be surprising, or what provocative is the word Murph used. I'll even venture into Norwich University and how Norwich might help on in some of these areas. Okay, let's begin by looking at the global trends. First and foremost, the climate as a function, it's a function of the average temperature of the globe, and it's getting warmer. We can measure using scientific data, which I'm not going to talk about, which will please all the mathematicians and the scientists in the room, since I was a history major. Using scientific data gathered from the Arctic and the Antarctic and elsewhere, we know that the Earth has seen great swings in temperature over millions of years. But we also know that across the few millennium of civilized man, temperature and sea level have been relatively stable. But in looking back over the last century, scientists see an alarming trend in increasing global temperatures. In January, both NASA and NOAA independently came to the conclusion that 2014 was the warmest year on record since 1880. As further reinforcement of the trend that the 10 warmest years have occurred since 2000, 8 of the 10 costliest storms have occurred, these storms to hit the United States, not the world, the United States, have occurred in the past 10 years, including Hurricane Katrina, Superstorm Sandy, and Superstorm Irene. And if the train is on schedule, you will hear the train go by to my right, your left, and that track was washed out on Superstorm Irene. There is no argument among the professionals, at least the climate professionals, that the increase in temperature can be attributed to increasing greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. 97% of the climate scientists agree. I used a number, so, you know, there's probably somebody in the room who thinks it's actually less or more than that number, but let's say it's a lot. Agree that the Earth is warming and will continue to warm further unless steps are taken to mitigate or reduce greenhouse gas emissions. We are already beginning to see this warming trend have dramatic impact on regional weather patterns, which in turn can cause and impact national security. Globally, we have seen recent prolonged drought acts as a factor driving both spikes in food prices and mass displacement of populations, Sudan being one of the places, each contributing to instability and eventual conflict. Anybody who is watching what is happening in Europe knows that we are seeing migrations from south to north of massive proportions that are destabilizing actually very, very modern countries who are having trouble handling refugees trying to get to Great Britain through France and to the Channel ports and so forth and so on. What to do with them? And there are obviously some not so good implications of what I just said. Who is coming in, and who are they, what do they really want, and some extremists are making the trip. So you see spikes in food prices and this migration. Now, probably the case that everybody knows about is 5 years of drought in Syria. 5 straight years of drought in Syria decimated the farmers' crops and caused the farmers, millions of them, to migrate into the cities, none of which were prepared to accept millions of refugees. And they quickly found they were disenfranchised with the government. The result was the civil war in Syria, And you know the rest of the story, and it's not good. ISIS, tribal conflict, religious conflict, general instability, and unnecessary deaths, profound numbers of deaths, and migration into Turkey and Jordan, and overwhelming, frankly, both Turkey and Jordan. Changes in climate effects like prolonged drought are difficult to attribute to any single source, and I wouldn't want anybody to think that we think that you can attribute all of this to climate change, but the fact is, it is a contributing factor. It is certainly true that the detrimental regional effects, including prolonged drought, are made more likely by this climate change. And additionally, we have observed unprecedented wildfires in Australia. Case in point, an entire low-lying island nations begin to plan for complete relocation to escape rising sea levels. Admiral Locklear, the PACOM commander, has told his subordinate commanders that they will probably not experience war in the Pacific. What they are liable to experience are major humanitarian crises, in particular, the disappearance of whole nations into the ocean. Profound. There are 4 other important factors worthy of note, which will accelerate the impacts of climate change. First is global population growth. 500 million people have been added to the population of the world since our first report in 2007. 500 million. And by 2025, there will be another 500 million. The world is exploding with people. And we will have trouble because most of this growth is in Africa and Asia. In all areas experienced increased population growth, stresses on food and water are apparent, and water resources are water, drinking water. That is of growing concern. Over the coming decades, I think those areas already stressed by water and food shortage and poor governance will present the greatest threat, near-term threat for conflict. In the longer term, many of these areas will be threatened by rising sea level. Migration will increase at an alarming rate, and we need to learn how to help others. I mean, it almost staggers the imagination what we could do, but somebody's going to have to do something. The second trend is urbanization. Nearly half of the world now lives in urban areas within a fairly short distance to the water. And of course, if you've got a large city next to the water, you've got problems. Miami is a case in point. The result is an increasing number of people at risk from extreme weather events and sea level rise. For example, Super Typhoon Haiyan devastated the Philippines and resulted in more than 6,000 deaths and $2 billion in damages. Whole city wiped out. That pales in comparison. I'm going to tell you about a storm that occurred in Burma. Cyclone Nargis, N-A-R-G-I-S, in 2008 killed over 130,000 people. 130,000 people killed in a single storm. You should expect to see more of these storms. There will only be so much we can do to keep the sea out. And in some areas, even if it does not flow over the walls we build, it can flow under or around and make the land unusable. Situate, south of Boston, 30 miles south of Boston. My niece lives on the water, directly on the water. She has a 30-foot seawall in front of her home. The waves broke above the seawall, the water crossed about 25 or 30 feet of a lawn into her basement. She survived. The house survived, but many other places did not survive. 30-foot seawall from the top of the seawall to the beach, built by the Corps of Engineers, by the way, Army Corps of Engineers. The other stuff did not survive. The rocks, the riprap was essentially blown aside. Look, these kind of storms will impact food-producing deltas, including the Mekong River Delta, the Delta in Bangladesh, and the Nile in Egypt. The world will have trouble feeding itself with that kind of stuff. The next trend is increase in the middle class. The increase in the middle class, they want more food, they expect energy, they want to use energy, they want automobiles. You can conjure up what all of that means. The National Intelligence Council predicts that by 2030, demand for food will increase by 35%, fresh water by 40%, and energy by 50%. Climate change will stress the world's ability to produce food and drinkable water at levels necessary to meet the demands. A 2012 Intelligence Council assessment held that water challenges will likely increase the risk of instability and state failure, exacerbate regional tensions, and divert attention from working with the United States and other key allies on important policy objectives. Interestingly enough, contrary to what I just said there, the Indus River, which flows between Pakistan and India, is shared by both Pakistan and India. Pakistan and India do not get along, and they both happen to have nuclear weapons. Interestingly enough, they do get along on how they apportion the water in the Indus River, because it has such a profound effect on the ability to maintain life that no matter what the crisis has been, they have been able to reach mutual agreement on how they apportion that water between the two countries. We have, by the way, Alabama and Tennessee have been arguing about how much water each of the states can take out of the Tennessee River for some time now. You got a bigger pipe than me, so forth and so on. Where's the dividing line? I don't think anybody's going to drop a nuke over the Tennessee River, but there is a lot of arguments about how the water in the Rio Grande, the Tennessee, and the Colorado River, how all of that takes place. It can be a source of conflict as well as a source of agreement. The final trend, I would note that the world is becoming more politically complex and economically and financially independent. You all know that, and you could see the way we all came together to solve the latest financial crisis. I don't know how the one we have now in Europe with the euro and Greece and so forth, and I don't think climate change has much to do with any of it, but let's just say we're all interconnected. Climate change impacts transcend national borders. Now, the impact on the military is fairly straightforward. We see, certainly in the Arctic, it's a place to look first. We're seeing a lot of change in the Arctic and an exponential rise in activity in the Arctic Ocean. We see the increase happening now. Last year, 73 ships sailed through the Northwest Passage. I will tell you that there are actually some boats you and I would think of as yachts went through. 73 went through in 2013. That's up from 4. Only 4 made the trip in 2006. Meanwhile, or at the same time, Denmark, Canada, and Russia have all laid claim to the oil-rich ocean floor at the North Pole. Canada obviously has a big stake in what happens up in the Arctic. Now, my maritime buddies on the committee have pointed out that we do not have the communications equipment, navigation aids, and sufficient icebreakers to respond to any kind of natural or man-made disaster in that fragile part of the world. We just don't have it. In other words, we're not prepared. When I say we, I mean the United States is not prepared to protect our vital interests. And you know, Alaska is part of that ocean, the North Slope. With fixed budgets and competing demands across several departments, investments in icebreakers and all kinds of equipment is at best problematic. Now, we are obviously, people like me were pleased to see that global climate change has been directed from the Secretary of Defense as a directed input to all defense planning. And inclusion in all defense plans will be activities related to global climate change. Global climate change will have three effects on the military: more demand, challenges to readiness, and new and harsher operating environments. The troops can get along in most, so we're not going to worry about the harsh environments. They're accustomed to it, even nights like this. We expect to see an increased demand across full spectrum of operations. Domestically, extreme weather and wildfires in the U.S. will increase demand for the National Guard and the reserves. And the Vermont National Guard obviously played a huge role in Superstorm Irene, as did some of the Norwich cadets, some of them probably in this room, for all I know, just like we we being Norwich, participated in the 1927 storm, which essentially did the same thing to the Dog River Valley, the mighty Dog. Once again, flooded its banks and did the damage that it did. The frequency and severity of these events, as well as the fact that domestic events and international events could happen simultaneously, will mean that demand for active duty forces will go up, and the demand for National Guard and Reserve forces will go up, and there will be a tension between domestic duties and overseas duties, and somebody has to apportion the shortages. This concerns us because obviously the services are getting smaller because of budget-driven issues. Globally, there will be an increased demand in humanitarian response and disaster relief. There were 13,000 military troops in the Philippines, a Typhoon Haiyan last year. Without pre-planning and staging, we will simply not have the capability or the capacity to respond if and when tens of millions of people who live in a city the size of Shanghai or Karachi, you kidding me? The two largest populated cities in the world, and they are right on the water. Or Dhaka in Bangladesh, 10th largest, gets slammed by a typhoon rated 5. Hundreds of thousands could lose their lives due to a storm like this, and in its aftermath, people will have to respond. In addition to more demand, which itself will stress readiness, our bases risk huge changes. Probably the largest naval base in the world, not probably, it is the largest naval base in the world, is at Norfolk, Virginia, down on the Chesapeake, where the Chesapeake meets the James and the York River in Hampton Roads area. Langley Air Force Base is directed, it isn't even above sea level in some places. I mean, it's right on sea level. Very important air base for the protection of the East Coast. It's at sea level. Fort Eustis on the James River, Little Creek, the largest amphibious port on the East Coast, is in danger of being consumed by the Atlantic Ocean. It's where we train, garrison, repair, maintain, and essentially deploy to faraway places vulnerable to sea level rise, extreme weather, including intense heat waves, which restrict training and so forth and so on. Finally, climate change will cause the military to be deployed, as I said, to harsher environments. So it gets cold, and we'll figure it out, like we always do. Now, national power. Okay, so what we have going on is not only a phenomenon coming from overseas, drought in the United States, Russia, and China, and so we have problems in North Africa and elsewhere. Now we're seeing problems back here in the United States. Now, national security includes all elements of national power: diplomatic, informational, military, and economic. On the vulnerability side, we can see it's assessed by degradations to a nation's political, I'm not going to get into that, military, economic, social infrastructure, and information. So we ask ourselves, how can our national power be eroded by climate change? Well, actually, it can be, and it involves the infrastructure. If we can't use the Mississippi River because of drought, and we can't get the barges, which are hauling this huge amount of foodstuffs to the port of New Orleans and the Gulf ports, or any other products to the Gulf, or the St. Lawrence, for that matter, which take grain out of the Midwest, the upper Midwest, if we can't get to the ports because of the locks and dams and the depth of the river, where the chief of engineers has to make a choice between irrigating fields in the northern part of the Mississippi up towards the Canadian border to keep water flowing in the Mississippi so he can move the food products, you can see the relationship. And it's not good. We depend on critical infrastructure for economic prosperity, safety, and the essentials of everyday life here in the United States. But to see this very vulnerable infrastructure, which is very fragile, and frankly, all you have to do is look out down under the railroad tracks to see how vulnerable we really are. Vermont lost 500 miles of roads, 200 bridges shut down in central Vermont for for weeks. There are people here who know what the real numbers are, so I'm going to stay away from all of that. Let's say it wasn't great. That was the 10th, that storm was the 10th costliest storm to hit the U.S. since records were kept. Interesting. The National Guard played a very important role in helping to make emergency repairs to the transportation system after Hurricane Irene. And like Vermonters have always done, like what they did in our own Civil War, they stepped up to the plate. I would point out, by the way, that 8 of the 10 costly storms to hit America have happened in the last decade. These numbers, these are the trends, okay, folks? Just look at the trend. Never mind the data point or whatever. The trends are not moving in the right direction. Specific attribution of these storms to climate change is not yet possible, so don't think I'm saying that. That's not a provocative statement by me, it's just a fact. It's not just extreme events that cause damages. In Vermont, observed changes include increases in very heavy precipitation. I was told, by the way, that Lake Champlain has only been frozen over I think it was last year. When I was here, you could drive trucks, huge trucks, across Lake Champlain to Plattsburgh. I mean, this is incredible what's happened. Heavy precipitation causes erosion and damages to homes and roadways and strains economic and community resilience. As we look around the country, we can see that much of the nation's energy infrastructure, including oil and gas refineries on the Gulf, or they're on the water. Interesting enough, because it comes in, you bring it in ships from elsewhere. Now we produce our own, and we can't build new refineries, so that infrastructure is weak. But it's located on the coastal floodplains, where they are increasingly threatened by sea level rise and intense storms and extreme flooding and rising sea levels. But we have examples of how extreme heat is damaging national transportation infrastructure, roads, rail lines, airport runways. And, by the way, extreme heat causes people to use more energy. Air conditioners. I don't know whether everybody in Vermont has an air conditioner. I don't have one down at Cape Cod, and we never used to have one. You just open the window. Apparently that doesn't work anymore. The projected impacts of climate change will threaten major sectors of the U.S. economy. According to the 2014 National Climate Assessment, quote, the observed warming and other climatic changes are triggering wide-ranging impacts in every region of our country and throughout our economy. So what does this mean to Norwich? What's this guy banging on about? Well, the way I see it is there are only a handful of institutions in the United States which have produced the leaders of tomorrow since 1819. If you look at the history of Norwich University, much of the original infrastructure in this country was touched by engineers from Norwich University. And today, we are producing the leaders of tomorrow who have the intellectual capacity taught here at Norwich, combined with a self-sacrificing patriotism that can make a huge difference. Engineering solutions, and not only engineering, but a combined effort by the political scientists, architectural students, the environmental science people, business. How do we pay for all of this? Venture capitalists, foreign investments. I ride on a toll road down outside of Washington that is owned by European investors. How does that happen? How do we do it? Engineering students, and oh, by the way, I want to just give a note to our Solar Decathlon carbon neutral house, which I understand is in the negotiation now to be mass produced. It's a big deal. That's a big deal. Norwich has a long history, a long, famous history of military engineers, professional engineers, business and educators involved in the infrastructure of our country. Maybe we need to get into it again in a big way, in a collaborative way. And I think we can begin by trying to think about developing cleaner energy sources and ways to continue growing our businesses and our transport and export networks with less energy. What's out there? What can we do? What can we talk about? How do we talk about it? I got lots of questions, no answers. But, we've got to ask the question, what about little nukes? What about nuclear, small nukes which can power big cities? Clean energy, carbon neutral. Okay, solar, wind. I don't know, I'm not big on wind. I don't know how to move the power, but maybe there's somebody in the room who thinks it's okay, but it's a big question. How do we answer some of those things? Or how do we talk about it? I understand, I had a conversation with Dr. White, who represents the Chief of the Corps of Engineers, and I have seen some discussion about the small nuclear generators, but I understand it's becoming more and more mentioned in Washington, which is positive. So let me sum this whole thing up, okay? Climate change is going to increase instability around the world, and unless we get our act together, we're going to have a hard time responding to it, okay? And I think we have to get innovative, and we have to take risk. And we need to find people who are willing to stand up and say, look, we have to do something. Because if we don't do something, we're going to find up with the Atlantic Ocean in the Back Bay of Boston. And Fenway Park will go into the drink. And you cannot find a codfish or a lobster in some of the places you used to find them in great abundance. And the fishing fleet at Gloucester is not moving, nor is the fishing fleet in New Bedford, and a whole culture has gone away. And if we're not careful, the maple tree will wind up in Canada. And that bothers the heck out of me, that whole litany. And I think we need to start thinking about it as a body. How do we want to play in that? This is from our last report. At the end of the day, we validate the findings of our first report and find that in many cases, the risks we identified are advancing noticeably faster than anticipated. We also find the world is becoming more complex, as if that's so apparent, I mean, it hurts, in terms of problems that plague its various regions. Yet thinking about how to manage it, these are wickedly hard problems to solve. All right, look. We got problems, okay? We're never going to have 100% certainty on what's going on in the world. And if you're waiting for 100%, you're going to get overrun. Guaranteed. We have to take a risk. The trends are going in the wrong direction. Pay now, pay later. We have to have a plan, and we have to get with it. And we need to think about how you serve. You, the students, you have the energy, you have the intellect. Frankly, I have served my whole life in uniform, in the uniform of the United States, either in it or around it. And often I ask myself, is the world better today because of what we did than it was? I don't have a good answer. I don't have a good answer. We're leaving you a tough challenge. Ask the tough questions. Say the surprising thing. You got to suck it up and get up out of bed in the morning and make things happen. And this is the place to learn how to do it. You have a faculty that is capable of leading you, and I think you ought to take advantage of what you have. Political posturing and budget woes cannot be allowed to inhibit discussion or debate over what is it's a salient national security concern for our nation, at home and abroad. Look, I never thought I would stand in front of any group anywhere and talk about this subject. I am thankful. I am thankful for the opportunity to have stood here and talked for probably too long, but I think it's important for us to wrestle with these issues. And I want to thank everybody who made this possible and everything that's going on here at places like Norwich University and other schools in America, and what's going on in the government with people who are willing to give of themselves for our country, in spite of people who say it's not real, it's a hoax, so forth and so on, take it to the bank. It's real. It's real. Thanks a lot to all of you. God bless you.
Thank you, General. I think the General is willing to spend a few minutes taking some questions. So we have 2 mics on stands in the aisles here. If you would, the mic on my left, your right is set up for cadets from the Corps and all that are not cadets from the Corps. Please use the microphone on your left aisle. And we'll just alternate back and forth between those if anyone has a question for General Sullivan.
Don't ask me how I did as a cadet, okay? Only the President knows that.
On the left, please.
Hello, sir. Mike Prairie, class of '83, Norwich forever. My question is about the Industrial Revolution that we had. We spent about 100 years or so developing the infrastructure of this country, and a lot of that was based on burning coal and spewing stuff into the atmosphere and all that sort of thing. And now we are a developed country, and there are other countries that are developing and going through their own industrial revolutions. And they're not as careful as we'd like them to be, but neither were we back in our industrial revolution. How do we deal with telling a country that's developing that, no, you can't do that, you have to do it a different way?
I think we do it with humility and care. I have some reason for optimism, at least I'm being told we should have, by the President's recent trip to China and the recent discussions that he had there about carbon emissions and so forth, which will be played out, I think, in Paris at the next conference. So, I mean, you have to have some encouragement there because the U.S. is willing to talk and negotiate with the Chinese, who obviously have a big role to play in that. They're not the only ones. But it's a good question, and I think the diplomats are working it hard, so let's have some degree of optimism there, but it's a good question. That shows the interrelationship, by the way, because what happens in Asia often blows into our far west. We know that some of the Fukushima pollution came east. Yes? What do you got over here?
Next question.
Good evening, sir. My name is Derek Latito. I'm a biochemistry major here at Norwich. And you said no numbers, and that's kind of difficult for me sometimes as a science guy, but I'll stick with that. In 2006, at the time of your study, the price of oil was probably at an all-time high of nearly $100 a barrel. And now
no, it was more than that.
It was more than that, but now it's nearly plummeted down to below $50 now. And climate change, one of the biggest ways that many have proposed to eliminate is to reduce our dependence on oil. And we're very dependent on oil, especially in the military for boats and planes, etc. How do you see the plummeted price of oil impacting the global interactions about climate change and the impact on national security?
Well, obviously, the military has been trying, not obviously, it probably isn't obvious to you, the military has been trying to come up with alternative sources of energy. They're hybrid, essentially hybrid engines, some of them with electrical motors on all the wheels. Electrical is created by generators and batteries, which use less fuel, and less fuel for generators which are powered by solar energy or whatever. And the tents and so forth, insulated. I know it's hard to imagine tents being insulated, but they are, with foam that you put in them and you just throw them away when you're done with them. But what? Well, but there's a lot of equipment, and that takes a lot of money, and it's a big investment, so they're working on it. Let's say everybody's working on it. The Navy's trying to use alternative fuels for obviously some ships are nuclear powered, so they don't have a problem. But they still have ships which use conventional stuff, fuel, and that is a problem. I don't think that the price of fuel is going to exacerbate the problem. Although middle class, people are buying more fuel. I bought it today for $1.20, something like that. And you can find it to be pretty cheap, so people are going on vacations. They're using their cars, and that's the normal reaction to this kind of stuff. It's a good question. The government's trying to get it done, and they've set some stringent targets for the military. So I don't know whether you know it or not, but the troops actually carry, Army and Marines carry solar panels on their rucksacks to charge the batteries. So, I mean, there's ways to do it, and there's panels that they lay on the ground and that charges the batteries. Batteries are a huge problem, by the way. How can we have all this equipment that has batteries, and we don't get much life out of the batteries. Every night sites, all kinds of electronics that use batteries, battery power, and we have to charge the batteries. It's a real challenge. 60-70% of the weight carried on the battlefield is liquid, water or fuel. 60 or 70%. Most people think it's ammunition. It's not. It's water and fuel. So we're trying. By the way, if you're in the biochemistry business, give us a hand. Can we, come up with, can we burn grass, sawgrass, or hey, sawgrass does it. Sawgrass does it now. Everybody thinks, other kind of, corn? I don't think that works, but because you got a conflict. Do you eat corn or do you burn it? You choose. Nothing's easy. These are wicked. I don't think it's a scientific term, but these really are wicked problems because you got pluses and minuses. You got to weigh them. It's a good question.
Thank you.
General, good evening. Colonel Rob Cook with the Naval ROTC program. And at the risk of sounding flippant, and I really don't mean to sound flippant, but if I may, what's the good news? Is there any good news in any of this?
Yeah, the good news is, let me tell you what the good news is. I told you a way out of it, and if you keep hope alive, it's a role for guys like me, okay? I'm not a hand wringer. But so I have to get up tomorrow. So frankly, if you were to ask me, what's the most important thing you said here tonight, that you can, in fact, as a college, as a university with 200 years of history of service to nation and peace and war, and a lot of it involved in the first industrial revolution, boom, a laser focus on this problem. Put Norwich on the map for the next 100 years. That's good news. Suck it up.
Thank you.
Just a couple more questions. We'll go to the right side.
Good evening, sir. My name is Power Donnelly. I'm a sophomore in the construction management program. I noticed that you choose your words carefully, and you say 8 of the 10 most expensive storms have happened in the last 10 years. not necessarily 8 of the 10 biggest storms have happened in the last 10 years. And I evidenced the hurricane of 1900 hit the Gulf Coast. My question is, how much do you think the increase in infrastructure and the increase in unit cost of the infrastructure has affected or warped that statistic?
Well, I don't know. If I understand your question, how much does the infrastructure impact that? I will tell you that the Corps of Engineers built a huge, let's call it a barrier, on Lake Pontchartrain, which frankly nobody knows about, including yours truly. I didn't know about it, and it was about a kilometer some long. It was almost like something the Dutch would do. And it kept the water from the last Gulf storm out of Lake Pontchartrain. And that caused an effect which limited the amount of water which could get to the new levees and the new dikes which were built by the Corps from overrunning New Orleans from the backside. So there are things that can be done to mitigate and attenuate this, what's going on. And I believe on the record, there is a lot of that kind of stuff which could happen down off of Manhattan. Something has to happen down at the mouth of the Hudson to stop that. And there are some plans, but they're very expensive. It's very expensive, but there are plans to do it. I don't know what's planned for Boston and so forth, because Boston is a little different. You have a lot of, if you're familiar with Boston Harbor, it's back a little bit, but not much. Good question. Yeah, I chose my words carefully. I don't, words count. Words count in this business.
If I may rephrase my question, so I meant the increased cost of construction with rebuilding and expensiveness of the storms.
Well, yeah, it's going to be increased cost, sure. I told somebody on the radio today, look, I took the Acela from Boston to New York during a snowstorm, okay? So I'm getting out of Boston, last train out of Boston, kind of like a movie, and we get to the Mystic River, and train stops. The conductor says, okay, we got to stop, we have the bridge problem with the bridge. Well, the problem with the bridge was solved by a guy in a pickup truck with his partner. They roared up, they had a propane tank and a torch and a sledgehammer. And they heated a pin, and the guy in the right seat with the sledgehammer drove a pin in so that the bridge, the trigger would go, and the green light came on, and we continued. That's the Acela. That's the fastest train on the East Coast, okay? I can go to Korea, Japan, China, Europe, and take trains that go up close to 300 kilometers an hour. Unbelievable. Where did the money come from? I had no idea. I have no idea. But I think if we want to be an economic power, we must move stuff on the rail. We have to move stuff on the Mississippi and the St. Lawrence. And somehow we have to figure it out. Can we use venture capital? Can we sell bonds to the Europeans? What does the business school say? I have no idea what the answer to that is. But you're right. Construction costs are going through the roof. The power plant built by a graduate of this university at Niagara Falls, largest power plant in America, cost $100 million. $100 million, and that was in, 1880s. $100 million? Where did that money come from? I don't know. What's Dr. Lord say? What does the record say? Where did that money come from? I think it would be worth asking somebody, how the hell did you come up with $100 million to do that? Okay, good questions. Yeah, it's more expensive. Pay now, pay later. That's apparent to me. Either we pay now or we pay later.
How about one more question, if we can take it from the left-hand side over here? Thank you.
Great, thank you very much. My name is Joy Fakis, and General, thank you so much for being here this evening to talk about this very important topic. I also would like to thank you for your words of encouragement and hope. I'm actually a sustainable investing research analyst, and I'm looking at these things on a daily basis and seeing hope every day with what U.S. businesses are doing, to combat climate change. The question I have for you really is about how do we clear the hurdle that we have in Congress right now. The 114th Congress is populated with some members who are in fact climate deniers and are pretty bent on overturning many of the strides that we've already made in terms of regulation with the EPA. How do we kind of change the conversation in Washington to move forward to make good on the agreement that President Obama made with the Chinese and to be able to make some kind of meaningful commitment in Paris in December?
Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot. That's a challenge. I am encouraged, though, that there's actually more acceptance of what we're saying. And Congress, by the way, you know the words count business? They're starting to accept mitigation and, Kate, what's the other word?
Adaptation?
Adaptation. Yeah,
Adaptation.
adaptiveness, okay? They weren't doing that before. I think outfits like the Military Advisory Board at the CNA, Center for Naval Analysis, I know they're willing to go up and testify. And obviously it's America, and there's vested interest, coal-producing states and so forth. I mean, as long as you understand that, I think we can make some inroads. There's others who are studying it too. And I just think if we could get a momentum going, certainly with the investment community, could we sell some of the infrastructure? Venture capitalists buy some of it? I mean, with tax breaks and so forth, I think that's the kind of stuff that needs to be explored. And I'm not qualified. Look, I'm a soldier, okay? I make no bones about it, and I'm proud to say that. I'm proud to let everybody know I'm an American soldier. That's what I am. I see a problem. And I think some of what you said, and I appreciate your words of encouragement. When you're redistributing ammunition on the fire base, okay, I know that's arcane thought to many of you. You're not telling everybody that we're not going to get out of here. What you're telling them is, okay, boys, keep it up. Boys, women, whatever, who's there. Whoever you got, by the way, keep it up. We'll do okay. Can't kid them. You can't kid them, and then they're going to look in there and they're going to see whether you're real. I can't kid you, but I think there's something we can do if we come together to do it. Thanks a lot.
I think we all agree that that was at times surprising and provocative. Thanks, sir. Thanks for your leadership of the university and continuing to shape it, as well as shaping our future leaders graduating from Norwich. I'd like to mention, as we end the evening, that the next Todd Lecture is in just 3 weeks, and information on that is in your program from tonight. So 3 weeks from tonight. And finally, I would like to close by again thanking the Todds, the Drews, and the Drew Foundation for making the Todd Lecture Series possible. Thank you and good night.